One last thing that I would like to cover, again, this is also optional and a little bit more advanced, is if you have multiple reducers in the code. Now, right now we just have a single one, but let's suppose there is a possibility that you're going to have more than one reducers, depending on what use case you have. Now, you don't need multiple reducers. You can, let's suppose you have another state variable. You can simply add that variable over here, and the component that is using that variable can only subscribe to that single state variable, and then you don't need a second reducer. Okay, but there might be some cases where you do need a reducer. Generally, if you have your medium-sized app, I would recommend sticking to one reducer. But anyway, Redux does support multiple reducers. So let me just show you how would you deal with multiple reducers. So let's suppose I want to create another counter that is going to increment by 2. Okay. Now, in a smaller example, you can just add a counter variable over here, another one that increases by 2. But I'm going to show you an example with a separate reducer. Okay, so I'm going to create another reducer over here. I'll call it, this is going to increment the counter by 2. So let's call it dose counter. I'm going to call it dose counter. Okay, uh, it's going to be kind of similar code, just like your counter increment. It is going to get some state and actions and everything. So let's go ahead and copy this code. It's going to be very similar. The only difference is it's going to increment by 2. Okay, that's the only difference. We'll keep it simple. This is not as important. The important part is how do we combine this reducer, or how does our app uses these reducers. So let's go ahead and see. Okay, so I do have these. Let's go ahead and add some actions over here. Instead of increment, I'll add dose increment. So I'll just create a couple of more. I'll simply say the action is going to be dose increment, dose increment, and let's call it those and those. Okay, now in my those counter, instead of using these, I will import those increment and those decrement. Okay, over here, I'm going to change this and change this as well. Okay, so far, nothing super crazy. It's still the same thing. The only difference is it adds them by 2. Okay, now here's the little bit the tricky part. If you have more than one reducers, Redux has a function called combine reducers. That's what you need to pass in. So if you recognize over here, the issue is the create store function can only take a single reducer function. You cannot pass more than one arguments over here. So now if you have two reducers or more than two, what do you do? How do you tell the store to use all of the reducers, right? So you cannot do it over here. What happens is your Redux has a function called combine reducers, and that's what we are going to be using. Okay, so I'm going to change my code a little bit. I'm going to come over here. This looks good. So I'm going to simply, I'm going to just export these variables out. And instead of doing this, I will just export them as over here. Okay, let me complete this and I'll talk about that. So the thing about this is, what we did earlier was we were creating a variable and then exporting it. Again, as you can see, we really don't need the variable because this is the only place this is going to be used. So this is the other way. What you can do is you can directly put export default before a function, and it is going to it is going to export that function for you without you creating a variable name. Okay, just a short form way. You will see a lot of people tend to use this as well. Same thing over here. So this is fine. but you will see it kind of, you have to create a variable over here and do this. Simply what you can do is, instead of creating an extra variable, you can just export this directly, and this will also work. Okay, now, so I have two reducers over here, and I have to call the function called combined reducer. So I'm going to do an interesting thing over here. Instead of working through this and importing these reducers, I'm going to create a index file, and I'm going to import both of them combined. Okay, remember the function of the index file is that you don't have to mention these particular file name. It automatically imports this file. Okay, now in this index.js, I'm going to call the combined reducers, and then I'm going to combine them and then send it to the store. Okay, so before we can do that, let's go ahead and import from the Redux module the function called combine reducers. Okay, and combined reducers is going to take an object as an argument, and that object is going to have the name of the reducers. Okay, so it kind of looks like this, combine reducers. Okay, and then the name of all the reducers. Okay, so what are the reducers that I want to combine? I want to combine our counter reducer and those counter reducers. So let's go ahead and import that. So I'm going to import from counter. Okay, let's call this counter reducer. You can call it anything you want, because remember we had export default without any name. And then over here I'm going to call it, I'm going to go ahead and import those counter, and I will just call it those counter reducer. Okay, I don't need these parentheses because I'm doing export default. These are needed if you don't do export default. Okay, so what do? Over here, I mentioned these two reducers. Okay, so my first reducer is going to be counter, and it will take this one. And my second reducer, let's call it those counter. This is going to be my those counter that I just imported on the top. Again, you can call these same names over here, different names, it doesn't matter. Okay, just to show you that these I'm using different names and it will still work. I have different names over here. By standard, you will see a lot of people just use the same names over here as well. Oops. Okay, as long as you know what you're doing, this will also work fine. Okay, but let's keep it separate so that you guys can see that these are different, and you need to pass these inside the combined reducers. Okay, remember combined reducers is a function that is given by Redux. What it does is, if you have more than one reducers in your code, it is going to combine them. Why? Because your store has capability to only take one argument. So what is going to happen over here now? I'm going to go over here, I'm going to change this, I'm going to import the index file, so I don't need any of the single ones. And oh, let's go back and see, did I export this out? I think I didn't export this, so I'm going to export this. So I will say export default. So whatever the return is of these combined reducers, this is going to be exported. I'm going to import in my store, and let's call it, we can call it combined reducers, root reducer, whatever you want to call it. So let's say this is going to be my root reducer. I'm calling it root reducer basically because all of them are combined. This is the only combination that is going to go over here, and I will do this, and my application should be good now. Okay. Uh, okay. Well, let's see. So it is not incrementing. Let's go ahead and try to find out what am I missing. Let's go back over here. So I'm importing this thing, combined reducers. These should be good. Let's go back to my those counter. I'm exporting. This should be good as well. export default state initial. Yeah, this is looking good as well. Let's go to our actions. This is good as well. And going back to the store, let's go ahead and refresh this one time to see. Okay, no, still some issue. I'm going to just stop this. Let's see if there's any errors. Okay, and okay, still not. It's not getting the initial state. So let's see what are we missing. I do have the correct import, so let's try this again. / reducers. Okay, and this is going to combine both of them. So let's go back over here. Counter those index combine reducers. Okay, and I'm export default. I'm passing in the two reducers that I want. They both are coming from here, and my counter reducer is here. My counter reducer, I have export default, which looks good. I come back over here. I have my, oh, okay. This might be an issue. So I'm using I forgot to rename this. This is going to be those count because this is a different state. So it should be this one. And I'm going to be updating those count. Okay, and it should be good. Okay, because this is a different state variable, this is a separate reducer. It is going to be different from what we have in our counter. Okay, so this looks good. Let me refresh, make sure. Okay. So debugging through this, trying to find out why my counter doesn't come up. I found the issue, and it looks like it's in my counter component. So here's the thing. If you look back over here, your map state to props variable over here, we were using state.count, and it works. It used to work previously, and that's where the issue is. The problem over here is now we are using combined reducers. So let me go back and open our combined reducers. Now there are two different reducers. So there are two different state maintained in this application. Now, when you're trying to access it, Redux cannot directly find which reducer, which state are you talking to, since you have more than one reducer. This is one of the things that I was mentioning, that it is good to have a single reducer so there's no confusion. But in this case, we have two separate reducers. This means that there are two different kind of states being maintained in this application. So one is part of the counter reducer, and the other one is part of the DOS counter or DOS counter reducer state. So when we are trying to access it, we need to exactly mention which reducer has that state. So in this case, the reducer that I mentioned is counter. So this will be dot counter. So you will see count comes up and everything is good. Okay. Just to clarify, we don't have to mention the names over here. You can simply do this way as well. Since we're combining the reducers, you can just put the reducer name. You don't have to mention, you don't have to rename it. The only thing would be then over here, you need to make sure you're mentioning the reducer name. So it just has to match the same one that you have over here. So I'll keep this without renaming so that you guys exactly know that what is this referring to, or what variable is this referring to. So I'll go ahead and increment and decrement, and everything is good. Again, remember, this is only applicable if you have more than one reducers in your application, and then you have to mention the state variable count, which reducer does it belong to. Okay, now we can go ahead and complete this example. So we can create another component. We already have reducer, so let's go ahead and create a component. We'll call it those counter component. Okay, it's going to be similar to our counter component over here. It's going to have the same stuff. So let's go ahead and most of these imports are going to be the same. So let's go ahead and copy over these imports. I'm going to copy this over. The only difference would be I don't need increment counter. Instead, if you go to my actions over here, I created a couple of more action creators for those counters. So these are the ones that I'm going to be using. So instead of this, I'll just say increment those counter, decrement those counter. Okay, let's go ahead and create our function component. Since this is, we don't need a state over here, so I'll say const those counter properties. Let's see, I'm going to have some props over here, similar to our counter variable. Close this. Okay, so I'm going to get some props over here. I'm going to be using object destructuring, and then I'm going to have my return, which is going to be some JSX. Let's go ahead and export this. Export default. We know we'll be using connect function over here, so let's go ahead and use our connect function. So I'm going to be saying connect. Okay, and then this is a higher order function. I'm going to pass this over here. Okay, let's go ahead and copy our JSX. It's going to be same, so I'm just going to copy this as a counter and modify accordingly. So I'll put this over here. Let's go ahead and format this. Click counter. This is fine. Let's call it dose counter. Okay, so this is the counter that is going to go down. Let's see, I'm going to receive a different variable. Let's call it dose count. So this is the property that I need to receive. I'm going to put it over here right now. It's going to give you an error because we do not have the map state to props. So I won't be receiving this property right now, but eventually I will. And then I'm going to be receiving some action creator. So I'll call them those increment and those decrement. And these are going to be received as props as well. Right now I'm not receiving them, so I need my map dispatch to props function. So we'll go ahead and create those so that we have access to these two action creators. Okay, so let's go ahead and let me refactor this format, and now we need our two functions, map. So we'll go ahead and create those, const map dispatch to props. Okay, and this function is going to receive the dispatch, and we're going to modify some, and then the other function is const map state to props, and this is going to receive the state variable, and we'll be doing something with that. Okay, so these two functions are going to be arguments, so I'm going to say map state to props and map dispatch to props. Okay, what happens in our map state to props function? We are going to be we're going to be converting our state variable to props. So let's go ahead and do that. And this is going to return an object, and let's call it those count. Since I called it those count in my property, I'll have to use the same name. And this is going to be mapped by the state variable that is being passed over here. Okay, now remember, since we are using combined reducer, we need to mention exactly which reducer this is belong to. Okay, and this belongs to, let's go back to our reducers index, it belongs to dose counter reducer. So this is the name that I need. So I'm going to close this, and I'm going to say dot. And what is the variable? What is the name of the state variable? We can go inside those counter reducer and see this is the name of the variable. So I'm going to copy this, and then I'm going to put this variable name over here. Now I have, this is going to be mapped to those count, and this can be used over here, and everything should be good. Okay, let's go ahead and format this. My dispatch function, okay, my dispatch function is going to return the two properties, the two functions. So we'll go ahead and do that. We'll just say return, and we are returning a object, okay, and we will call it those increment function, and this property is the functions. I'm using the arrow function syntax, and this is going to dispatch what action. It is going to dispatch those increment counter action. So let me go back up over here, this one. This is the action creator that is going to be returned, and same as those, let's call it those decrement. Again, why am I calling this? Because this is the name that I mentioned in the property, so these two needs to match. We need to keep the same name convention, and I'm going to say dispatch, okay, and this is going to be the one that I just imported. I'm going to copy this over, put this here, function. Okay, so this is looking good. Very similar to our counter component, it's just a different component, that's all. Okay, reusability, I'm using the card body. So as soon as I include this in my app, it should show up. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go to my app.js. I'm going to import slash components slash this counter. Okay, I'm going to import that, and I'm just going to call that component. Okay, and there it is. See, just we just added this. We added our component. We have these functions over here. Map dispatch to props. We use the connect function to connect this component to Redux as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and try that. Let's try the first one. This increases by 1, so this is looking good. Decrement is working. So those counters should increase by 2, so looking good. Even numbers. And decrement, it should decrease by 2. Okay, so this, in this example, basically what I showed you guys is you have more than one components which are using more than one reducers. Okay, if you have more than one reducers, then you're going to use combined reducers. The only caveat to that is just make sure in your counter, in your components, when you're using map state to props, you're able to refer it by the reducer. Okay, but generally this is a, I wouldn't say rare case, but generally you will see that we have a single reducer per application, and you can see the reason as well. This only has one state variable. You can include multiple state variables, so I could have done those count here as well, and it should have worked. Okay, I could have all these action. I don't need a second reducer. Okay, so this application can be done with a single reducer as well. Start with a single reducer until you reach a point where you can see that there is a difference between the reducers. Like the count reducers, they kind of go together, so it's okay. But there might be some cases where the state is completely different. It is a different domain. It is a different use case, which doesn't really go together. That's where when you create a separate reducer. Please don't go ahead and start creating reducers for each state variable. The state belongs together. So if you have multiple state variables, they all can be part of the same reducer. Okay, you're going to create a separate reducer if logically the same state variables doesn't make sense to go together. That's the use case for combined reducers. My recommendation is, first of all, don't have multiple reducers, only have single reducer, but kind of follow the same folder structure. This will help you organize your Redux applications better, and it will help you debug faster without running into more complications.